Let's move on and take a look at the ecosystem. Now, we're going to be using a material-based ecosystem. There are two types of ecosystems. There's painted and material. Painted also goes with material, so basically there's the global ecosystem, which is tied to the ecosystem painter, and then the material-based ecosystems, which are connected to specific materials in the scene. Now, if I double-click and open up our grass and rock material that is on all of our terrains, there's two different ways we can add an ecosystem. We can choose to add an ecosystem to these specific materials, whether or not we just want trees to appear just on the grass and not cover up the rock areas that are showing. Or we could do an overall ecosystem, which is going to cover the entire mixed material. So we're going to do that, having an ecosystem covering everything. And if you take a look at the scale, our scale is set to 100. And I'm going to turn on ecosystem. And it does look like I ran into a little bit of a bug. I'm going to click OK and open the ecosystem layer back up, and we can see a little icon for the ecosystem. And now everything's showing correctly. And now we have a new layer. So we have our main material layer, the ecosystem layer, and the mixed material. Now looking at that scale, we can see that the mixed material size has been changed. And whenever you add an ecosystem, it does tend to change your scale. So really pay attention to what your scale was of your material layer before you add an ecosystem so you can change it back. Set that to 100, and now we can see that it's going to show up correctly. You may need to refresh some of your material previews, and as we can see, it's not really matching the one below it. That's okay. Material scale doesn't affect ecosystem, and it will not affect the size of ecosystem objects, although it will affect the underlying layers. So if we change the ecosystem scale, it will modify the scale of all the materials underneath it. So keeping it at 1 is what we want in order to preserve the scale of all of the materials below it. And we're using the world standard mapping mode. And what we can do is add in rocks, plants, or objects. And we're going to start by adding in a plant. And now we can see all of the available plants and trees that come with View, or anything you have loaded in. I have all of my collections that I've created also loaded in. We're going to go to trees, and now I want to make a note about some of the quality differences between some of these trees and kind of the way they're laid out. The first, in this case, the first row I have, really because of the scale, if I was to change the scale, those rows are going to change. But with my current view, the first row is basically all of the older view trees. These are very lightweight and work better in some cases for ecosystems. Not always, but they do require less memory as an ecosystem, but you don't get as much quality. So it might be something that you only used for distant. Now, some of the other trees, as we get more down in the list, are newer trees that are much higher resolution. Large European ash, and some of the HD trees as well. These have a very high polygon count on the trunks, and not so much on the leaf surfaces, and may not be needed for an ecosystem. And really, it's not suggested that you use it for an ecosystem, although you can. So I'm going to use some very basic trees for now, and start with a maple tree. And what it's going to do is create some previews. It kind of getting ready to render out some of the previews of the object, I'm going to add in another plant and select the plum tree. And we're just going to have a couple of basic plants in here, and also the springtime white birch. So rural maple tree, plum tree, springtime white birch. And we'll also see the new materials loaded in. So we have the maple leaf and the plum leaf, and on the white birch it's also the maple leaf surface. But this way you can directly modify the ecosystem materials when they're loaded into the population. Now we have a couple options, which is basically to set the scale of each one of these trees and their presence amount, so how much we see them in the scene. But right now we don't have any indication of scale or anything. So what we need to do is populate. There's two different types of population. Direct population, which we do by clicking populate, and dynamic population, which is a population at render time. So with dynamic population, we don't see a preview until we click render. Once we render, those previews become available if under File and Options and Display Options, you have Preview Dynamic Ecosystems turned on. You can also set the max number of instances and display size in pixels, a couple of different settings here. I'm going to be using a direct population method because we have a very small scene. So I'm going to go back to that ecosystem layer. And what I want to do is modify the scale. I really want a much larger scene. And with the current size of the terrains, rather than modifying the scale of the entire scene, which will modify the materials since we're using World Ecosystem, what we can do is go to the Scaling and Orientation tab, and we have an overall scaling amount. This is going to modify the scale of all of the ecosystem population objects. So it will reduce the scales of everything and not just independent scales. So we can bring down the overall scaling to 0.1. I'm going to turn off dynamic population and populate so we can just see the trees. And when we're using the direct population method, the polygon count in the bottom, if it's set to polygon count and not free resources, will update. And we also get a preview, or not so much a preview, but an actual amount of the instances that are being created. Now, an instance is an actual plant in this case. Every plant is an instance. They're not just copies of the same object. When you're using view vegetation species, it's using what's called solid growth, which is generating new plants for every single instance, and it's not just creating exact copies. To understand this a little better, I'm going to load in a plant into the scene that's not part of the ecosystem. So over on the left, underneath the terrains, we have the plant icon. We can right-click, and that's going to open up the same window we had before for choosing the ecosystem. And let's go ahead and select the maple tree. And I'll just move it a little closer. We'll switch the 4 viewports. And we'll move that by the camera. As we can see, these terrains are really small. So we can go ahead and scale this down using the gizmos. So if I double click on the tree, it's going to open up the plant editor. We can make a lot of modifications to plants within the plant editor. Adjust the length of the tree, fall off between the branches and the leaves. There's also different subsets available. In this case, there's only one for the branches and one for the leaves. We'll go a little more in depth into modifying and changing these settings a little later. But just to demonstrate how solid growth works, we do have the option to grow a new plant. So when we select new plant, a new tree is grown based on this vegetation species. So we're using the rural maple tree, and every time we click New Plant, it's going to generate an entirely new tree. So that's what's happening when we create an ecosystem. It's generating a new plant for every single instance, so we'll never have the exact same object duplicated over and over. Some of them might be a little close, but for the most part, it creates enough variation where they all look completely different. Now, I want to change the position of my camera, but I don't want to lose the current camera I have. And we could either record the current position values, orientation, carry them over. But the best thing to do is if we take a look in the main camera view, there's a little disk icon that allows us to store the camera. If I expand the main camera, we can see we now have the main camera, a top camera, and camera 1. Camera 1 is now the duplicate of the main camera, so we have it stored. If we use the arrows, we can move in between the top camera and over to camera 1. And we can also see which camera is selected. Right now, number 2. 0 being the main camera and the first camera. So what I'm going to do is keep camera 1 as this stored angle and go back to the main camera and just change that. So we can always switch the camera view over. What I want to show you is some of the preview options. And right now, as of View 8, a new previewing option is available, and it's called the shaded billboard. Now the actual geometry isn't showing up in the scene. What we're seeing is a flat image plane using normal mapping based on the lighting to show what this tree is going to look like. When we render, it's going to look much better than just this billboard and this flat shaded look. So I'll just go ahead and create a quick render and we can take a look at the scene and then look at the previewing options for these ecosystems. So we can see a fairly equal distribution of everything in the scene. The plum trees are really small. I also want to note that there is a built-in color variation in a lot of the different vegetation species, which is why you're going to see with that white birch, which is the lighter green leaves, a color variation change between a lighter green and more of a yellow. The maple trees also have that color variation, but it is much more subtle. So let's take a look at the previewing options. You can also see too that using these lower res species really doesn't have too much of an impact since we're farther away from them and we're not doing close-ups. But right now, using the shaded billboard mode, which is the new default, if you are using, go to File and Options, under Display Options, the Shader 4. If you're using an older video card, Shader 4 isn't available, then the shaded billboard mode is not available, and what you will see is just the billboard mode, which is a much lower quality preview. But with very extensive scenes, you might need to switch some of the materials over. You also have the ability to add additional ecosystem materials in different layers on top of each other. And I do want to note that the display option is a global display option for the entire material, and you cannot set individual layers to different display modes. There's a lot of options. We could set them as wireframe boxes. You can see that updating. You can also set to smooth shaded mode. Now what this is going to do is display the full geometry of every single ecosystem instance. Not suggested for an entire ecosystem, especially in this case. Because then we're not just using a preview of the 584 million polygons in the scene, we're using the actual display of all of the geometry at that full quality. So the best thing to do if you want to see full quality is use full quality near camera. What that will do is allow you to set a range, radius around the camera, keeping in mind too that radius, it does not extend in front of the camera, it is around the camera. So everything behind the camera as well, equal distance as what's in front of it, is also displayed full quality. Now, because I have such a small scene, I really don't need to have it set so high. I can go back and change that radius down to maybe 5 meters. And now we'll see that full quality preview, really depending on what settings you have for your plant instant draw. The lower quality or lower amount this slider is, you'll see a more polygonal look to the geometry. So this way we could get a little more precise view of the ecosystem. And then for farther away instances, we don't need to have all that full quality. The shaded billboard looks really good. So let's go ahead and modify some of these settings. I'm going to take the plum tree and make it a little bit larger. Let's double the size, set it to 2. Birch trees don't live very long, so there wouldn't be an equal distribution of birch trees as there are maple and plums. Of course, it all really depends on what you want to have in the scene, but I'm going to set the presence to 0.1. So that's going to be 10% compared to what it was before. And the overall presence amount, we're going to have equal amount of the maple and plum, and then 10% of the distribution that there was before will be the white birch. Repopulate, we can still see those plum trees are kind of small. Maybe I'll bring that scale up to 3. And we'll go ahead and use 2.5. Now overall the density is set to the default. If you go to the density tab, we can change how many objects or plants we have as part of the ecosystem. The more we increase the density, of course, it's going to fill in the scene much more, all the way up to a percent of 100, which is going to fully cover everything, depending on what's set in the environment tab. We'll take a look at that in a sec. There's also a sampling quality, and this is going to be linked to the variable density and also the environment settings. It's going to adjust the quality of distribution based on the variable density, decaying or foreign objects, and also any settings in the environment tab. So if you want to have something that really confines to a specific density amount, then you can increase the quality boost a little more. So now we have a really huge density amount. I'm going to reduce that down to about 80%, repopulate, and maybe we'll use 90%, fill it in a little bit more. And I'll just do a quick render. Let's go back to the main camera view, where we can see that our trees are still a little large. So if we go back to the material, we can choose to set the overall scaling, but we're going to reach a point where we can't really make it any smaller, so we will need to modify, in this case, the overall regular scale of each instance. I'm going to cut, just bringing them down to around half. You can populate, and the dynamic population can become very useful for scenes like this as well, because we have a lot of area outside of the camera view that is being populated that may not need to be in the scene. It also does tie up system resources. We're now up to almost 7 billion polygons in the scene. Let's go ahead and take a look at a render right now, what we currently have, and then we'll go ahead and adjust some of those other settings. So because of the scale, the forward ecosystem instances are a little large, kind of blocking out everything else. So I might want to either remove some of those, reduce density, maybe just an overall scale. But I do like the size that they are on the mountains and the terrains we have set up. So there's a couple of different ways to reduce some of those scales. First, let's take a look just at the environment controls. Anytime you have a layer and one material on top of another, the environment tab becomes available. This applies to ecosystems and also materials, where it's essentially the same settings. What we can do is adjust altitude range, slope, and then the orientation, just as we were controlling the mixed material. But this is a more direct method. So if we want to only have these ecosystem instances show at a lower altitude range, we could adjust the altitude range, pulling down the max amount. So it's just populating on the lower portions. And we can see that the mountains themselves and the high peaks of the terrains are not really being covered up. Now I'm just going to maybe pull our camera up a little higher. Because we have so much distance, we shouldn't need to worry about losing too much the look of the angle. We could pull down the altitude range a little more, and we're going to start to see a subtraction around. So let's go back to our other camera, and we can see where the ecosystem starts to kind of separate itself. Now it looks like what's happening here is we either have an influence based on this other object, or because we're using the same material on all of these objects, the absolute range or the object scale is affecting the altitude for the individual terrains rather than the material. So in this case, if we set the range of altitude based on the material, it's going to incorporate all of the materials and all of the objects that have this material. And we should be able to get a much better look by switching it to material. So now we can see that instead of being based on the object itself and each individual object, it's based on the material, which is applied to 3 different objects, but the total altitude is the highest point of the material, which in this case would be this back terrain. There's also an absolute mode if you want to set it based on meters, or whatever your unit is set to. If you go to File and Options, Units and Coordinates, you can set display unit. Metric automatic is the default, 0.1 internal unit set to meters. The automatic mode will automatically switch between centimeters, meters, kilometers based on the input amount. It won't always show the exact unit. If you set it to meters, then everything is going to show in meters, no matter how large the size is, which means you can end up with some very large amounts, a lot of zeros after some of your numbers that you may not need. So metric automatic works the best. The internal unit I'll explain a little bit later. So let's go back and take a look. I'm going to set this back to the biomaterial. We can also set the slope range, which is going to, at higher amounts, and if I get rid of the altitude, we'll be able to see it a little better. So we'll increase full altitude and just populate on flatter surfaces. Towards the top of this slider is going to be flatter parts of the material or the object, and we might need to increase that sampling quality if we want to get something a little more accurate. Unlike some of the other sampling qualities in View, this will not increase overall render time. It may take slightly longer to populate, but for the most part, it doesn't really impact the render. It does impact, of course, the look of the ecosystem, but it's not like where a lot of the other sampling qualities, which are going to drastically increase render time. So now we can see that the ecosystem is populated just on flatter surfaces, and since we had those rocks added to the terrains, we do have some flat surfaces on the larger terrains. So now if we just wanted to populate on steeper slopes, we could pull down that top slider, repopulate, and this is just going to populate the ecosystem on the steeper slopes. And if it's set too low, then you're not going to see anything. So we might need to increase that amount in order to get anything to really show up. So now we're just seeing the steep slopes being populated. Pretty basic controls. The fuzziness option is a fall off and a gradient. We'll show it with altitude. So we'll bring the altitude down to halfway, full slope range. And we have a fuzziness top and bottom. So since we want to see a fall off from the top, we'll increase the fuzziness amount, click populate, and what it's going to do is create a gradient fall off for the ecosystem, fading to that top. So it starts to go beyond and thin out. The more we increase that, the more thinning of the ecosystem we're going to see, reaching its way beyond the max altitude range. Because I have such a highly dense ecosystem, it may not be showing perfectly, but it does give you a good idea. So there are a lot of controls in that respect. So these settings are pretty straightforward. Just as we control the distribution of the material, we can control the color of an ecosystem, the overall scaling of the individual objects, direction from the surface, which would be the object itself, whether or not it's going more perpendicular to the side or straight up vertical, different rotation options. And we'll take a look at those a little more later. We're just creating a basic scene right now, so I'm not going to make it too complex. Because I lifted the camera up, still looked pretty good, I am going to increase the scale of the ecosystem, adjust some of these settings. And then switch back to our main camera.